Steins Gate is, by far, the best visual novel that I've ever read. Everything from the plot, to the music, to the references, to the sequel and spin-offs, it was all peak. Steins Gate left such an impression on me that I felt that I had to make a video on it. So I started drafting a script for a video on knowledge's function in the show. However, while I was, slacking off, this video popped up on my homepage. Now, I've never actually watched Attack on Titan before, so I didn't watch this video, but the impression of AOT being like the Bible stuck, and I started playing around with the idea that maybe Steins Gate has biblical references of its own that I could bring up in my own video. And that's when I connected my own draft about knowledge to the biblical story all about knowledge, the story of Adam and Eve. Now, I wasn't all too familiar with scripture, so I didn't know how credible this connection actually was. However, after reading and analyzing the story-specific verses, I realized that Steins Gate not only has a lot in common with Adam and Eve's plot, but it also romanticizes a lot of the assumptions the story makes about knowledge and paradise, among other things. Due to this, I've come to theorize that Steins Gate is really just a twisted retelling of the story of Adam and Eve, in which Eden is not a paradise, but rather a gilded cage. So, if you are curious in finding out how Steins Gate transforms the classic story of Adam and Eve into a guilt-filled psychological horror, then I advise you sit back, relax, and enjoy this ride through time, kinda like what Okabe does in this story. What the fuck am I saying? The story of Adam and Eve begins with none other than Eden. Eden, in the Bible, is described as a perfect paradise created by God for humans. Steins Gate opens in Okabe Rintaro, our Adam, in an Eden of his own, the attractor fields. Now yes, these affected world lines are anything but a traditional paradise. However, they are perfect in the sense that the attractor fields ensure that each set of world lines converge on specific points, no matter what. To circle back to Adam and Eve's Eden, Eden, although being perfect, has one rule. After God created Adam, God stated that Adam may freely eat of every tree in the garden, but of the tree of knowledge he shall not eat, for in the day that he eats of it, he shall die. The specific language here is important because God isn't saying you can't eat of the tree, but rather, God is warning Adam that he should not eat of the tree, or else. The same warning from God is paralleled twice in Steins Gate. The first instance in which this warning is stated is in Steins Gate's opening monologue where, amidst Okabe's ramblings, he states that it is ridiculous for man to exceed light speed, and how that is God's final warning against those willing to rebel. The reference to man exceeding light speed most directly refers to time travel, so God's warning in this monologue is, in a nutshell, to not mess with time. With this in mind, we can say that the tree of knowledge is the phone microwave, and the actual forbidden fruit is the experiments done with those machines. The second instance, or rather instances, where Okabe is made aware of this warning is the entire first half of Steins Gate, where he and his lab members mess around with time. Throughout these 12 episodes, or 5 or so odd chapters, the lab constantly grapples with the idea of if they should continue to experiment with D-mails, continue hacking CERN. All the while, Okabe is personally receiving threats on his phone from an unknown entity. Yet in the same way that Adam and Eve did end up eating of the Tree of Knowledge despite God's warning, Okabe and his friends continue to play God until it's too late. However, it's important to understand that neither Adam nor Eve nor Okabe ate of the fruit of knowledge by their own volition, but rather, they were influenced by a third party, that party being the Serpent. In the story of Adam and Eve, Eve eats of the forbidden fruit, then gives it to Adam, because she is tempted by the serpent. In Steins Gate, Okabe gains the forbidden knowledge of time due to serpents of his own, those serpents being the lab members, or more specifically, theorize, Luca, and Moeka. Okabe, after realizing that the phone microwave was a time machine, wanted to keep the lab niche and not reveal the secrets they uncovered. Furthermore, he, despite his pretentious nature, was cognizant of the consequences of changing world lines and didn't want to play God for the sake of playing God. These ideas are mirrored in the story of Adam and Eve by Eve's admitting to the serpent that she is not to eat of the forbidden fruit. However, these three members, in the same way that the serpent pushes Eve, directly push Okabe to send more D-mails for the sake of their furthering their own agenda, whether it be Theorize's wanted to bring her dad back, or Luca's wanting to be a girl, and finally Moeka's wanting to find the IBN. I didn't specify the other lab members as serpents because Daru and Suzuha don't really ever push Okabe to send emails, while Mayuri and Kurisu serve an entirely different purpose that I will go over later in the video. Yet with all that said, it's important to note that, unlike the serpent who had malicious intentions in tempting Eve, neither Favoris nor Luca or even Moeka pushed Okabe to send emails out of bad will. And in the end, it was Okabe's decision to send those emails, which is mirrored by it ultimately being Eve's, then Adam's, decision to eat of the fruit. Yet despite it being Okabe and Adam and Eve's decision, none of them ate it out of malicious intent either, but rather, they all ate it out of curiosity. You see, Eve ultimately ate of the tree of knowledge because she saw that the tree was good for food and that it was a delight to the eyes, and that the tree was to be desired to make one wise. And after eating it, she gave some to her husband, Adam. Okabe, similarly, was already interested in the concept of time traveling well before he even realized what his phone microwave was, a fact which is proven through his knowledge about John Titor and time travel theories, along with his attendance of both Nakabachi and Kurisu's seminars. This clarification is important because it shows how both Eve and Adam and Okabe's curiosity are blameless. Therefore, they aren't wholly guilty. Yet curiosity or serpent or not, Adam, Eve, and Okabe all did eat the fruit, thus breaking the rule of Eden, thus leading them to their own fall. After Eve and Adam ate of the tree of knowledge, they had the revelation that they were naked. In Steins Gate, while Okabe is sending or facilitating the sending of all the emails, he realizes that he is naked by his being the only person who can remember across world lines. Okabe has an ability dubbed Reading Steiner, which allows him to transfer his memories across world lines. Except since he is the only person with the ability to remember, he alone carries the burden of the knowledge of all the world lines, a burden which is proven to be especially heavy in the latter half of the show. I bring this point up because in Adam and Eve, both Adam and Eve eat of the forbidden fruit, and they both equally gain knowledge and realize their nakedness. However, in Steins Gate, Okabe alone holds the godlike knowledge of the world lines, and he alone feels naked because of it. Due to this, Adam and Eve cannot be two people in Steins Gate, but rather, Okabe has to be both Adam and Eve. Now, the lab's research ultimately culminates into Kurisu's upgrading of the phone microwave into the time leap machine, a machine they end up deeming too powerful for them to handle. However, by the time they come to this conclusion, it's too little, too late. Their lab is raided by CERN, and Mayuri is killed in front of Okabe's very eyes. In this moment, despite all of his warnings, does Okabe finally realize that he messed up. Adam and Eve, after realizing that they themselves were naked, sewed clothes for themselves and attempted to hide from God, since they knew that they broke his rule. Okabe, after watching Mayuri die, is bought enough time to time leap 2 hours into the past, and with the knowledge of Mayuri's death imprinted into his mind, desperately tries everything to save her. However, no matter what he does, she dies. Although Okabe repeatedly sews clothes and hides by time leaping over and over again to try and protect himself from his nakedness being the burden of his knowledge, he can't do much and is ultimately powerless against convergence. When God calls out to Adam and Eve asking where they are, Adam, who really can't do anything, reveals himself and Eve and confesses that both of them ate of the tree of knowledge, while Eve blames the serpent for deceiving her. God responds to this by punishing the serpent with forever having enmity with humanity, punishing Eve with having to feel the pangs of childbirth, and finally punishing Adam with having to eat bread by the sweat of his face until death. After Okabe finally confronts the truth of Mayuri's death being convergence, Okabe vows to undo every D-mail in order to reach a world line where Mayuri does not die. With every D-mail he undoes, he, as Eve, is punished with the pangs of trying to give life to Mayuri by his having to sacrifice the lives each of his lab members lived in each world line he undoes, which we know eventually leads to him having to feel the ultimate pain of having to sacrifice Kurisu in order to save Mayuri. And to further add insult to injury, when Okabe does finally reach the Alpha Attractor field in which Mayuri is safe, he is told that he can actually save Kurisu, only for it to fail, and turn out that he is the one who actually killed her in the beginning of the show, thus fully realizing the ultimate pain of having to now literally kill Kurisu in order to reach a world where Mayuri lives. Furthermore, throughout this entire sequence of events, there's enmity put forth between the Serpents, Theoris, Luca, and Moeka, and Okabe, because Okabe has to willfully choose to undo the lives they've lived in each false world line, which he does. And as for his punishment as Adam, well, that hasn't happened yet, because unlike Adam and Eve, Steins Gate diverges. After Okabe kills Kurisu, two entirely different timelines occur, with one being the events of Steins Gate 0, and the other being the true ending. Now, Adam and Eve, unlike Steins Gate, doesn't diverge. And right now, we're at the point in the story in which God is supposed to exile both Adam and Eve from Eden. However, we can't possibly square away Adam and Eve's one timeline of exile with Steins Gate's two timelines of imprisonment and freedom, right? Well, actually, we can, and we can do that through a turnabout in thinking. In the story of Adam and Eve, God doesn't exile both Adam and Eve because they broke his rule. Instead, he exiled them in order to prevent them from eating of the tree of life and thus becoming immortal in a state of sin. God's exile was not really a punishment, but rather it was a blessing. Divergence in Steins Gate's timelines represents that same decision made in order to protect Okabe from being immortal in a state of sin. Okabe's state of sin is represented as the living of both Kurisu and Mayuri. And if either of them are dead, Okabe is at risk of immortalizing their deaths, and thus immortalizing his state of sin. With that in mind, we can see that the Steins Gate 0 timeline represents the consequences of if God were to choose to not exile both Adam and Eve. Since Okabe gave up on trying to save Kurisu, he immortalized her death, thus immortalizing his state of sin, which causes him to mentally break down throughout the entire sequel. However, God in Adam and Eve exiles the first humans in order to prevent an equivalent outcome, which is represented through the Steins Gate timeline. In this timeline, Okabe is directed by a Steins Gate 0 self on how to both save Kurisu and prevent World War III, both of which are needed for him to do in order for him to reach Steins Gate, which he does in the end reach. Okabe, in this timeline, prevents himself from becoming immortal in a state of sin because although he'll have to live with the knowledge of their deaths for as long as he lives, neither of their deaths were immortalized. And in the same way that Adam and Eve repented while mortal on Earth, Okabe can move on from the fiasco that was a random 2 weeks in August and enjoy his mortality in a world outside of the attractor fields. Except hold on just a minute. Up until now, I've told the story of Steins Gate as a story without God. However, the story of Adam and Eve depends on the existence of a divine decision maker. So without God, or an equivalent mastermind, the entire story falls apart. Well, thankfully, Steins Gate does have an equivalent mastermind. Yet I've been avoiding directly stating who that is, simply because up until now, I haven't had the full context to truly answer that question in a way that makes sense. So then, if we interpret God as the creator, then there's only one person in Steins Gate who has done the same as he in creating Eden and Adam and so on. And that person is Okabe. Okabe is not only Adam and Eve, Okabe is God. So Okabe isn't actually a god, however, he does serve the same function that God serves as the creator. Steins Gate, despite this video, is a story about quantum mechanics, and two fundamental concepts of quantum mechanics that you need to know in order to understand the story are the concepts that all particles exist as probabilities until observed, and that time exists as the past, present, and future simultaneously. In Steins Gate, Okabe serves as God because he is the observer. Unlike everyone else in the show, he can retain his memories across world lines, therefore meaning that the same him can observe different world lines. If we couple this idea of Okabe being the observer with the concept of time stated before, we can see that Okabe creates the Eden that is the world lines affected by attractor fields, because he is the only person who is able to and has actually realized all of the world lines into one coherent world, therefore meaning that every Okabe before him will live in his realized world. If we use the same logic, we can also see that Okabe created the serpents that drive him to experiment with time, because although he didn't literally create or observe Ferris, Luke, and Moeka, he is the one who fills them in about the knowledge of time, thus meaning that he, to an extent, facilitates their ability to, for lack of a better term, manipulate him into sending emails. With that said, Okabe, in the same way that God creates Adam and Eve, also created his own duality as Adam and Eve. If we remember the concept that the past, present, and future exist simultaneously, it can be understood that Okabe, in all states of his journey, exist. And because these Okabes all exist at the same time, Okabe can serve as both God and Adam and Eve, regardless at where he is time-wise, because there will always be a future Okabe dictating the world to him, thus making him mortal, and a past Okabe whom he is dictating the world to, thus making him like God. However, with all that said, if we are to believe that Okabe is God's equivalent as well as being both Adam and Eve, in the same way that God was defied by Adam and Eve, Okabe must have been defied by himself. Well, he was. The entire story of Steins Gate all culminates on Okabe deceiving himself. In the story of Adam and Eve, even though God exiling Adam and Eve from Eden wasn't necessarily a bad thing, exile is still framed as a punishment for man's defiance. In Steins Gate, Okabe's goal is to exile himself to Steins Gate because, in the same way that God exiling of Adam and Eve is good, Okabe's reaching of Steins Gate is also extremely good. However, in order to exile himself to Steins Gate, Okabe has to defy himself by deceiving both the world and himself. More specifically, Okabe has to both prevent World War III and save Kurisu, both of which are things that he, as God, set as law. We know that Okabe set into law Kurisu's death because in the very beginning of the show, he saw her bloody body and thus realized her death. Furthermore, we know that Okabe set into stone World War III due to Suzuha's knowing of World War III and Okabe's experiences in Steins Gate Zero. However, Okabe manages to defy himself by finding loopholes in his own law. Although Okabe initially thought he set into stone Kurisu's death by his seeing of her body, in actuality, all he saw was her body, which doesn't necessarily indicate her death. Therefore, he can defy himself by making sure the past him sees the same bloody body, but without Kurisu actually being dead, thus saving her. Okabe can also prevent World War III by simply removing any reason for World War III to start. In Steins Gate, World War III only starts because of the Nakabachi papers which caused the global time machine arms race. However, by Okabe removing the metal upa that protects those papers from burning, the papers cease to exist, thus removing all reason for World War III to start. Okabe, like the goat that he is, does all of this, and successfully defies the rules he himself set as God, thus allowing himself, in the same way that Adam and Eve were exiled from the safety of Eden to the mortality of the outside world, to be exiled from his Eden of the attractor fields to Steins Gate, a world where, as his punishment as Adam states, he will have to work for the bread that he eats until the day he dies, for there is no longer convergence to save him. Steins Gate is one of those stories where everything only makes complete sense once you finish it. So with everything finally explained, let me tell you the full, twisted story of Adam and Eve that Steins Gate tells. Steins Gate tells the story of a lone observer who, with the godlike knowledge of time and the mastery over the world lines, sets into place contradictory laws unknowingly. These laws are made known through convergence, and although they punish man for eating of the tree of knowledge, they still ultimately serve to ensure that man eats of the tree, thus transforming Eden, the attractor fields, into nothing more than a prison. When the first Adam, who was subject to both these laws and the serpents created out of these laws, lost his innocence, he was punished like Eve in having to feel pain in order to bring forth life. Yet despite this, he was unable to escape from the prison that was his Eden, since God refused to exile him. God created Eden for man after all. However, this Adam, forced to eat of the tree of life, chose to still punish himself with having to toil for as long as he was destined to live, all for the sake of finding a way for an Adam before him to defy the divine laws and find a way to exile himself from Eden. In the end, this first Adam found that way, so he relayed his message through time in hopes for a better tomorrow. After the second Adam experienced all the same as the first, he, at the divergence point, received the first Adam's message, and with both knowledge and motivation unknown to the perfect Eden in which laws account for everything, he was able to deceive the world by bypassing loopholes within the laws set in place, thus allowing himself to be exiled from Eden, and thus choosing once again the punishment of having to work for the bread he eats until the day he dies, since there is now no longer an Eden of attractor fields to save him. Steins Gate ultimately presents the fall of man not as a punishment of exile, but rather as a triumph of escaping a gilded cage.